Heir Stolen by the Enemy. Caterina Bellini had once had everything: a powerful last name, a city at her feet, a future carved in gold. But when her family betrayed the wrong people, when the empire burned around her, the only man who could save her was the one she had sworn to hate. He found her in the wreckage, untouched, a queen without a throne. And when he spoke, his voice was nothing but quiet satisfaction. "You look better on your knees," he murmured. "Now, let's discuss how you plan to repay your debt." Chapter 1. The Ashes of Yesterday's Empire. The scent of smoke still clung to the air, a phantom limb of the inferno that had consumed Caterina Bellini's life. It wasn't the acrid, choking smoke of a common fire, but a richer, more insidious smell: the aroma of burning cedar, of ancient tapestries turning to ash, of oil paintings melting into grotesque, surreal forms. It was the smell of a legacy collapsing, of a dynasty crumbling to dust. Even now, weeks later, nestled in the relative safety of a small, unassuming apartment in the Trastevere district, Caterina could taste it on her tongue, a bitter reminder of everything she had lost. The apartment was a far cry from the Palazzo Bellini, her family's ancestral home, a sprawling monument to generations of power and influence. Here, the walls were thin, the furniture was worn but clean, and the only view was of a narrow, cobbled street perpetually shaded from the Roman sun. Yet, there was a quiet dignity to the space, a sense of resilience that mirrored Caterina's own forced adaptation. She had meticulously cleaned every surface, arranged the few salvaged belongings: a silver-backed hairbrush, a worn copy of Dante's Inferno, a single, unframed portrait of her mother with a deliberate care that bordered on ritualistic. Caterina traced the delicate silver filigree of the hairbrush, her fingers lingering on the initials engraved there. A.B.
Alessia Bellini.
Her mother, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering loyalty, had vanished in the chaos, swallowed by the same flames that had devoured their home. No body had been found, no closure offered. Just the gaping, agonizing void of uncertainty. The memory of that night was a fractured mosaic of terror and disbelief. The staccato bursts of gunfire, the screams echoing through the marble halls, the chillingly calm voice of Marco Verone, the man who had orchestrated it all, issuing orders with the detached precision of a surgeon. Marco Verone, head of the Verone family, their oldest and most bitter rivals. A man Caterina had known since childhood, a man she had, in the naivety of youth, even considered a friend. She had been spared, a twisted act of mercy, or perhaps a more calculated cruelty. Verone had found her in the library, surrounded by the collapsing shelves of ancient books, her white dress miraculously untouched by the flames. He hadn't raised a hand against her. He hadn't even spoken a word of threat. He had simply looked at her, his dark eyes burning with a cold, possessive fire. "You look better on your knees," he had murmured, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that sent a shiver of fear and something else, something disturbingly akin to fascination, down her spine. "Now, let's discuss how you plan to repay your debt."
The debt.
Not a monetary debt, of course. The Bellinis had amassed wealth beyond measure, but that was all gone now, seized, burned, or vanished. This was a debt of blood, of loyalty, of something far more profound and terrifying. It was the debt of a life spared, a debt that bound her to Verone in a way she couldn't yet comprehend. Caterina rose from the small, worn armchair and walked to the window. The street below was coming alive with the evening's activity. A fruit vendor was arranging his wares, his calls echoing in the narrow alley. A group of elderly men were engaged in a heated game of cards at a small, outdoor cafe, their voices rising and falling in a familiar, comforting rhythm. Life went on, oblivious to the private apocalypse that had engulfed Caterina. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the chill of the evening air despite the lingering summer heat. She was no longer Caterina Bellini, heiress to an empire. She was simply Caterina, a woman stripped bare, forced to confront the ghosts of her past and the uncertain terrors of her future. A sudden, sharp rap at the door startled her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. It couldn't be Veron. He wouldn't announce himself. He would simply appear, a shadow in the doorway, a silent predator claiming his due. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at her to remain silent, to pretend she wasn't there. But another, deeper instinct, one forged in the crucible of loss and survival, urged her forward. She had to face whatever awaited her, even if it was her own destruction. Taking a deep breath, Katerina opened the door. A young woman stood there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She was dressed in simple, dark clothing, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. She held a small, worn leather-bound book in her hands.
Signora Bellini?
The young woman asked, her voice barely a whisper. Katerina nodded, her throat tight with apprehension. The young woman extended the book. My father asked me to deliver this to you. He said it was important. Katerina took the book, her fingers brushing against the young woman's trembling hand. The leather was cool and smooth, worn with age. She recognized the book instantly. It was her father's journal, a private record of his thoughts, his fears, his secrets. She hadn't seen it since before the fire. Your father? Katerina asked, her voice hoarse. Who is your father? The young woman swallowed hard. He was a servant at the palazzo. Giovanni. He didn't survive. A fresh wave of grief washed over Katerina, a sharp, stinging pain that pierced through the numbness that had settled over her. Giovanni, the old gardener, a kind, gentle soul who had always had a smile for her, even when she was a child. He saved this, the young woman continued, her voice choked with emotion. He said it contained the truth about everything. The young woman's eyes darted nervously towards the street, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. I have to go, she whispered. Please be careful. And then, she was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk as quickly as she had appeared. Katerina stood there, clutching the journal to her chest, her mind reeling. The truth. What truth? What secrets did this worn, leather-bound book hold? And why had Giovanni risked his life to save it? The questions swirled around her, a vortex of uncertainty and dread, leaving her standing on the precipice of something unknown, something that felt both terrifying and profoundly significant. She was alone again, with only the whispers of the dead and the weight of a past she could no longer escape to guide her. Chapter 2. A debt inscribed in shadows. The journal felt heavy in Katerina's hands, a physical manifestation of the burdens she carried. She closed the door, leaning against it for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. The small apartment, once a refuge, now felt like a cage, the walls closing in on her. She needed air, space to think, to breathe. She walked to the small balcony, stepping out into the twilight. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and exhaust fumes, a uniquely Roman combination. Below, the street life continued its unhurried dance, oblivious to the turmoil raging within her. She opened the journal, her fingers tracing the familiar, spidery handwriting of her father, Antonio Bellini. The first few pages were filled with mundane details, accounts of meetings, observations on the political climate, notes on the family's various business ventures. But as she turned the pages, the entries became more personal, more introspective. She found passages detailing his growing concerns about the Veron family, his suspicions about Marco's father, the late Lorenzo Veron. Lorenzo grows bolder, one entry read, the ink slightly faded. His ambition knows no bounds. He covets not just our power, but our very existence. I fear he will stop at nothing to achieve his goals. I must be vigilant, protect my family, protect Katerina. Katerina's heart ached at the mention of her name. Her father, always so strong, so seemingly invincible, had been afraid. He had foreseen the danger, yet he hadn't been able to prevent it. She flipped through more pages, her eyes scanning the entries, searching for answers, for clues. Then she found it, a passage that made her blood run cold. I have made a terrible mistake, her father had written, the words stark and filled with a palpable sense of despair. A pact with the devil, forged in desperation. I have promised something I may not be able to deliver. Katerina, my beloved daughter, I pray she never learns the truth. The truth. The same words the young woman, Giovanni's daughter, had used. What was this terrible mistake? What had her father promised? And to whom? The answer, she suspected, was staring her in the face, embodied in the chilling presence of Marco Verone. A sudden noise from below startled her. She looked down, her eyes focusing on a figure standing in the shadows across the street. A tall, imposing figure, cloaked in darkness. He was watching her. She couldn't see his face, but she knew. She knew who it was.
Marco Verone.
He had found her. Katerina quickly retreated inside, closing the balcony doors and drawing the curtains. Her heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She felt trapped, hunted. The journal slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor with a soft thud. She sank onto the worn armchair, her body trembling. She had to think, to plan. She couldn't simply wait for Verone to make his move. She had to understand the nature of the debt, the terms of the pact her father had made. She had to find a way to protect herself, to reclaim her life. But how? She was alone, powerless, stripped of everything that had once defined her. She had no allies, no resources, no leverage. All she had was this journal, this cryptic record of her father's mistakes. She picked up the journal again, her fingers tracing the worn leather. It was more than just a record, it was a connection to her father, a tangible link to the past. And perhaps, just perhaps, it held the key to her future. She began to read again, this time with a renewed sense of urgency. She devoured every word, every sentence, searching for any detail, any clue that might shed light on her father's desperate bargain. She read about his growing fear of Verone, his increasing isolation within his own family, his desperate attempts to find a way out of the trap he had set for himself. And then, she found another passage, a single sentence that sent a chill down her spine. The key lies with the Falcone. The Falcone. Another powerful mafia family, rivals of both the Bellinis and the Verones. A family known for their ruthlessness, their cunning, and their unwavering adherence to their own twisted code of honor. What role did they play in this deadly game? Were they allies? Enemies? Or something else entirely? Katerina closed the journal, her mind racing.
The Falcone.
She had to find them. She had to learn what her father meant, what connection they had to the pact, to her debt. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But it was the only lead she had. The sound of a car pulling up outside broke through her thoughts. She tensed, her muscles coiling, ready to spring. She crept to the window, peering cautiously through the curtains. A sleek, black car was parked across the street. The same car she had seen earlier. The driver's side door opened, and Marco Verone emerged. He stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on her apartment building. He was a figure of imposing power, even from this distance. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hair slicked back, his features sharp and predatory. He exuded an aura of danger, of controlled violence, that made her breath catch in her throat. He started walking towards the building, his steps slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Katerina knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't let him find her here, cornered and vulnerable. She grabbed the journal, stuffing it into a small satchel along with a few other belongings she had salvaged. She had to escape, to disappear. She had to find the Falcone. It became a singular purpose, throbbing with desperate resolve. The Falcone represented a fragile chance. And now, she had no other choice. He was almost at the door. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Palazzo Bellini. Escape was a frantic scramble, a desperate flight through the labyrinthine back alleys of Trastevere. Katerina moved with a speed born of fear, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She knew the neighborhood well, having explored it countless times during her privileged, yet sheltered youth. Back then, it had been a romantic adventure, a glimpse into a world far removed from her own. Now it was her only sanctuary. She slipped through narrow passageways, ducked under low-hanging laundry lines, and blended into the shadows, becoming one with the night. She could hear the faint sounds of pursuit, the distant echo of footsteps, the muffled roar of a car engine, but she didn't dare look back. She had to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between herself and Veron. Her destination was a small, unassuming church, tucked away on a quiet side street. Santa Maria in Trastevere. It was a place of solace, a place where she had often sought refuge from the pressures of her family life. She hoped it would offer her sanctuary now, at least for a few hours. She slipped through the heavy wooden doors, the scent of incense and old stone enveloping her. The church was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from flickering votive candles and the faint glow of stained glass windows. A few elderly women were kneeling in prayer, their heads bowed, their lips moving in silent devotion. Katerina found a secluded pew in the back, sinking onto the hard wooden bench, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She closed her eyes, taking deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. She was safe for now, but she knew it wouldn't last. Veron would find her eventually. She opened the satchel, pulling out her father's journal. She had to continue reading, to decipher the clues, to find a way to contact the Falcone family. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries, searching for any mention of them, any detail that might help her. She found several references to meetings with Falcone representatives, coded messages, and veiled threats. It was clear that her father had been walking a tightrope, trying to balance the demands of two powerful, ruthless families. He had been playing a dangerous game, and he had lost. Then, she found an entry that made her pause. "I met with Donatello Falcone today," her father had written. "He is a cold, calculating man, but he is also a man of his word. He offered me a proposition, a way out of my predicament, but it comes at a price. A price I am not sure I am willing to pay." Donatello Falcone, the current head of the Falcone family. A man even more feared than Marco, Veron. A man known for his unwavering loyalty to his family and his ruthless efficiency in dealing with his enemies. The proposition. What was it? And what was the price? Katerina had to know. She continued reading, her eyes glued to the page. The proposition involves Katerina. The next entry read, "Falcone he wants her. As a guarantee. A bond between our families. A marriage. A marriage." Katerina felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been traded, like a piece of property, a pawn in her father's desperate game. He had offered her to Donatello Falcone, a man she had never met, a man known for his cruelty. She slammed the journal shut, her hands trembling. She couldn't believe it. Her own father had betrayed her, had condemned her to a life of servitude, of fear. She felt a surge of anger, a burning rage that consumed her. But then, another thought occurred to her. If her father had offered her to Falcone, and Falcone had accepted, then why hadn't the marriage taken place? Why was Veron hunting her now? Something didn't add up. She reopened the journal, her eyes scanning the remaining entries. She found no further mention of the marriage, no explanation for why it hadn't happened. But she did find one final, cryptic sentence. "The meeting is set. The old palazzo. Midnight. The old palazzo." It could only mean one thing. The Palazzo Bellini, her family's ancestral home, now a burned-out shell, a monument to her ruin. But why would her father have arranged a meeting there, after the fire? And with whom? Katerina closed the journal, her mind reeling. The old palazzo. It was a dangerous place, a place filled with ghosts and memories. But it was also the place where her father had made his final, fatal mistake. And, perhaps, it was the place where she could find the answers she needed. She knew it was a risk, a foolish, desperate gamble. Veron would be looking for her there. But she had no other choice. She had to go back, to confront her past, to uncover the truth. She rose from the pew, her legs feeling unsteady. She walked to the altar, kneeling before the statue of the Virgin Mary. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer. A prayer for strength, for guidance, for protection. She didn't know what awaited her at the Palazzo Bellini, but she knew she had to face it, whatever the cost. She had to reclaim her life, her future. She had to avenge her father's death and her own stolen destiny. The whispers of her ancestors seemed to echo in the vast, silent church, urging her on, reminding her of the Bellini legacy. A legacy she would either restore or bury forever beneath the rubble. The decision and the danger were entirely hers. Chapter 4. The Serpent's Gaze Unyielding. The Palazzo Bellini loomed before her, a skeletal silhouette against the inky Roman sky. It was a ghost of its former grandeur, a charred husk of opulence and power. The once imposing facade was now scarred by flames, the windows gaping black holes, the roof partially collapsed. It was a place of death, of destruction, of shattered dreams. Caterina approached cautiously, her senses on high alert. She stayed in the shadows, hugging the crumbling walls, her every step measured and silent. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay, a constant reminder of the inferno that had consumed her life. She found a broken window at the rear of the palazzo, a jagged opening that offered a precarious entry point. She climbed through, her hands scraping against the rough edges of the glass, her heart pounding in her chest. The interior was a scene of utter devastation. The once grand ballroom was now a wasteland of charred debris, the marble floor covered in ash and rubble. The air was heavy with dust, the silence broken only by the creaking of loose timbers and the rustling of unseen creatures. Caterina moved slowly, carefully, her eyes scanning the darkness. She was searching for the library, the place where Veron had found her, the place where her father had kept his most precious secrets. She found it, or rather, what was left of it. The walls were blackened, the bookshelves collapsed, the books themselves reduced to piles of ash. But amidst the destruction, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A single, metal strongbox, partially hidden beneath a fallen beam. It was untouched by the flames, its surface gleaming in the faint moonlight filtering through the broken windows. Caterina rushed towards it, her hands trembling as she tried to lift the heavy beam. It was too heavy, too firmly wedged. She needed something to pry it loose. She searched the debris, her eyes scanning the wreckage. She found a twisted piece of metal, a remnant of a chandelier, its once brilliant crystals now shattered and scattered. It would have to do. She wedged the metal under the beam, using all her strength to pry it upward. The beam groaned, resisting her efforts. She pushed harder, her muscles straining, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, with a loud crack, the beam shifted, freeing the strongbox. Caterina collapsed to her knees, her body exhausted, her hands throbbing. She reached for the strongbox, her fingers tracing the cold, smooth metal. It was locked, of course. She examined the lock, her mind racing. It was a combination lock, a complex mechanism that would require skill and patience to open. She had no idea what the combination was. But then, she remembered something. Her father had always had a peculiar habit of using dates as his passwords, significant dates in his life, in the family's history. She tried his birthday. Nothing. Her mother's birthday. Nothing. Her own birthday. Nothing. She was about to give up when another date came to mind. The date of her parents' wedding anniversary. She carefully dialed the numbers, her heart pounding with anticipation.
Click.
The lock sprung open. Caterina slowly lifted the lid, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object.
A key.
Not a physical key, but a small, intricately carved piece of ivory, shaped like a falcon, its wings outstretched, its eyes gleaming with tiny, embedded jewels. The Falcone family crest. Caterina picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool ivory. It was beautiful, exquisite, and undeniably dangerous. This was the key to unlocking the secrets of her father's pact, the key to understanding her own fate. A sudden noise from behind made her whirl around, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure was standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light.
Marco Verone.
He had found her. He stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on her, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in a dark suit, as always, his presence filling the ruined space with a palpable sense of menace. "Katerina," he said, his voice soft, dangerous. "I knew you would come." He started walking towards her, his steps slow and deliberate. He moved with the grace of a predator, his gaze never leaving hers. It was the serpent's gaze, unyielding, hypnotic, promising both pain and a strange, terrifying allure. Katerina stood her ground, clutching the ivory falcon in her hand. She knew she couldn't escape. He had her cornered. But she wouldn't surrender. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "What do you want, Marco?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. He stopped a few feet away from her, his eyes flickering over her, lingering on the ivory falcon in her hand. "I want what is owed to me," he said, his voice a low growl. "I want what your father promised." "My father promised you nothing," Katerina retorted, her anger rising. "He was a desperate man, trapped by your family's greed." Verone smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Desperate, yes. But also foolish. He thought he could outsmart us. He thought he could protect you." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, his fingers inches from the ivory falcon. "But he failed. And now you belong to me." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The game had changed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about possession. And she was caught between two predators, one offering a gilded cage, the other an unknown abyss. She had to choose, and choose quickly. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Shattered Crown. Katerina met Verone's gaze, her own eyes blazing with defiance. "I belong to no one," she said, her voice firm, despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "I am a Bellini, and I will not be treated like a prize to be won." Verone's smile widened, a flicker of amusement in his dark eyes. "A Bellini? You are nothing but the ashes of a fallen dynasty, Katerina. Your name, your family, your legacy, it's all gone. I took it all." His words struck her like a physical blow, a painful reminder of her loss, her vulnerability. But she refused to let him see her weaken. She lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering. "You may have destroyed my home," she said, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage, "but you will not destroy me.
You will not break me."
Verone took a step closer, his presence looming over her, his scent a mix of expensive cologne and something darker, something primal filling her senses. "You misunderstand, Katerina," he said, his voice a low, seductive murmur. "I don't want to break you. I want to reshape you. I want to mold you into something more fitting. A queen worthy of my empire." His words were both a threat and a promise, a chilling glimpse into his twisted vision of their future. He saw her not as an equal, but as a possession, an ornament to adorn his throne. Katerina tightened her grip on the ivory falcon, the sharp edges digging into her palm. It was her only weapon, her only link to a possible escape. "And what if I refuse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Verone's smile vanished, his eyes hardening into chips of obsidian. "You have no choice, Katerina. Your father made sure of that. You are bound to me, by blood, by debt, by fate." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her hand, sending a shiver of revulsion and, disturbingly, a flicker of something else, something she couldn't quite define, through her. But he continued, his voice softening again, his touch lingering on her skin. "I am not a cruel man. I can be generous. I can offer you a life of luxury, of power, of privilege. All you have to do is submit." His words were a silken trap, a web of temptation designed to ensnare her. He was offering her a gilded cage, a life of comfort and security, in exchange for her freedom, her independence, her very soul. Katerina looked at him, her mind racing. She was trapped, cornered, with no apparent way out. But she was also a Bellini, a descendant of a long line of strong, resilient women. She wouldn't surrender without a fight. She remembered her father's journal, the cryptic message about the Falcone family. The ivory falcon in her hand was the key to unlocking a potential alliance, a possible escape from Veron's clutches. But how could she use it? How could she contact the Falcone family, with Veron standing right in front of her? She needed a distraction, a way to buy herself some time. She looked around the ruined library, her eyes searching for anything that might help her. She saw a pile of charred books, a broken chair, a shattered window. And then she saw it, a loose stone in the wall, partially hidden behind a fallen tapestry. It was a small, insignificant detail, but it might be her only chance. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She had to act quickly, decisively. "You say I have no choice," she said, her voice steady, her gaze locked on Veron's. "But you are wrong. I always have a choice." And with that, she lunged towards the wall, her hand reaching for the loose stone. Veron reacted instantly, his hand grabbing her wrist, his grip like a vice. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Katerina struggled against his grip, her other hand reaching for the stone. She managed to dislodge it, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. Behind the stone, a small, hollow space was revealed, and inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, was a small, silver whistle. A whistle. Katerina's heart leaped with a flicker of hope. It was a signal, a way to call for help. But who would hear it? Who would come? She didn't have time to think.
She had to act.
She brought the whistle to her lips, ignoring Veron's tightening grip, and blew with all her might. The sound that pierced the silent, ruined palazzo was shrill, desperate, and carried on the echoes of a shattered crown. It was a call for help, a cry of defiance, a gamble on a future she couldn't yet see. And she had no idea if anyone would answer. Chapter 6. Beneath the Veil of Civility. The whistle's piercing sound echoed through the ruined palazzo, fading into the stillness of the night. Katerina held her breath, her heart pounding, her eyes fixed on Veron. His grip on her wrist tightened, his expression a mixture of anger and surprise. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. Katerina didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her defiance unwavering. She had made her move, thrown down the gauntlet. Now, all she could do was wait. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the creaking of the old building and the distant sounds of the city. Minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an eternity. Veron's gaze searched her face, his eyes probing, questioning. He was trying to understand her, to decipher her motives. But Katerina remained an enigma, a closed book. "Who are you expecting?" he asked, his voice softening slightly, a hint of curiosity creeping into his tone. "Who do you think will come to your rescue?" Katerina remained silent, her gaze unwavering. She wouldn't give him any information, any advantage. Suddenly, a noise from outside broke the silence. The sound of footsteps, approaching quickly. Veron tensed, his grip on her wrist tightening even further. He turned his head, his eyes narrowed, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were coming from the main entrance of the palazzo, the grand, imposing entrance that had once welcomed guests from all over the world. Veron released Katerina's wrist, his attention now fully focused on the approaching threat. He moved towards the doorway, his hand reaching inside his jacket, presumably for a weapon. Katerina seized the opportunity. She quickly retrieved the ivory falcon, which she had dropped during the struggle, and stuffed it into her satchel. She then moved towards the broken window she had used to enter the palazzo, her escape route. But as she reached the window, she hesitated. She couldn't simply leave. She had to know who was coming. Was it the Falcone family? Or someone else? She peered cautiously through the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see figures moving in the darkness, approaching the palazzo. They were heavily armed, their faces hidden in shadow. She couldn't tell who they were. But she knew one thing. They weren't Veron's men. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire erupted, shattering the silence. The figures outside opened fire on the palazzo, their bullets ripping through the already damaged walls. Verone returned fire, his own weapon barking in the confined space. The library became a battleground, a chaotic scene of violence and destruction. Katerina ducked for cover, shielding herself behind a fallen bookshelf. She was caught in the crossfire, trapped between two warring factions. She had to get out of here. But how? She crawled along the floor, staying low, trying to avoid the flying bullets. She reached the broken window, her escape route. But as she prepared to climb through, she heard a voice.
Katerina.
It was Verone's voice calling her name. He sounded desperate. She hesitated, her heart torn. She should leave, escape while she could. But something, some inexplicable force, compelled her to stay. She turned back, her eyes searching the smoky darkness. She saw Verone, crouched behind a fallen pillar, his back to her. He was firing at the attackers, his movements quick and precise. But he was outnumbered, outgunned. He was losing. And then she saw it. One of the attackers, moving stealthily through the shadows, approaching Verone from behind. He raised his weapon, aiming at Verone's back. Katerina reacted instinctively. She couldn't explain it, she didn't understand it, but she couldn't let Verone be killed. Not like this.
Marco.
She screamed, her voice piercing through the din of gunfire. Behind you. Verone turned, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw the attacker. He fired his weapon, hitting the attacker in the chest. The attacker fell to the ground, his weapon clattering on the floor. Verone turned back to Katerina, his gaze intense, questioning. He had heard her warning. She had saved his life. But there was no time for explanations, no time for gratitude. The battle was still raging. The attackers were pushing forward, their numbers overwhelming. Verone was running out of ammunition, his position becoming increasingly precarious. Katerina knew she had to do something, anything, to help him, even if it meant risking her own life. She looked around the ruined library and an idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked. The attackers were advancing, and the veil of civility that had masked the brutal reality of this world had been ripped away. She was no longer just a pawn. She was a player, whether she wanted to be or not. And she had a debt of her own, a debt of a saved life, to consider. Chapter 7. A bargain struck in darkness. The library was a chaotic tableau of destruction, the air thick with smoke and the scent of burning wood. Katerina scanned the room, her mind racing, searching for anything she could use to her advantage. Her gaze fell upon the remnants of a heavy velvet curtain, partially torn and hanging precariously from a broken rod. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. She moved quickly, her movements surprisingly agile, fueled by adrenaline. She reached the curtain, her hands grasping the heavy fabric. It was old and dusty, but surprisingly strong. She waited for the right moment, her eyes fixed on the attackers, who were steadily advancing on Verone's position. He was firing his last few rounds, his back against the wall, his situation desperate. As one of the attackers stepped into the open, Katerina made her move. She pulled the curtain with all her might, sending it crashing down on the unsuspecting attacker. The attacker was caught off guard, entangled in the heavy fabric. He stumbled, his weapon falling from his grasp. Verone seized the opportunity. He fired his weapon, hitting the attacker before he could recover. Katerina's small act of defiance had bought Verone precious seconds, a brief respite in the relentless assault. But it wasn't enough. The attackers were still coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Verone turned to Katerina, his eyes meeting hers across the smoky room. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, surprise, gratitude, and something else, something that looked almost like respect. "Get out of here, Katerina," he yelled, his voice hoarse above the din of gunfire. "This is my fight, not yours." Katerina shook her head, her determination unwavering. "I'm not leaving you," she shouted back. "We're in this together." She didn't understand why she was doing this, why she was risking her life for a man who had destroyed her family, her home, her future. But she couldn't leave him. Not like this. Suddenly, A new sound pierced the chaos. The sound of sirens, approaching rapidly. The police. Someone must have heard the gunfire, alerted the authorities. The attackers hesitated, their advance faltering. They knew they couldn't stay, not with the police on their way. They began to retreat, firing a few last rounds as they disappeared back into the night. Veron lowered his weapon, his body slumping with exhaustion. He looked at Katerina, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sirens and the crackling of the dying embers in the ruined library. Katerina walked towards Veron, her legs feeling unsteady. She stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze searching his face.
Who were they?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Veron shook his head, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. I don't know, he said, his voice hoarse. But they weren't Falcone's men. This was something else. The sirens grew louder, closer. The police would be here any minute. Veron looked at Katerina, his gaze intense. We have to go, he said.
Now.
He grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly gentle. He led her towards a hidden door in the back of the library, a secret passage that she had never known existed. They slipped through the door, disappearing into the darkness, just as the police burst into the palazzo. They found themselves in a narrow, underground tunnel, a labyrinth of passageways that ran beneath the city. Veron seemed to know his way, guiding her through the darkness with an effortless confidence. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Katerina's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had saved Veron's life. He had saved hers. They were bound together by a shared experience, a shared danger. But what did it mean? Where did they go from here? Finally, Veron stopped. They were in a small, underground chamber, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. There was a table, a few chairs, and a cot in the corner. We're safe here for now, Veron said, his voice echoing in the small space. He released her hand, his touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary. He looked at her, his gaze searching, questioning. Why did you do it, Katerina? He asked, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. Why did you save my life? Katerina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and defiance. I don't know, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Maybe I'm as foolish as my father. Veron smiled, a faint, wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
Perhaps, he said.
Or perhaps you are something else entirely. He paused, his gaze holding hers. We have a common enemy, Katerina, he continued, his voice low and serious. Someone wants us both dead. We need to work together to find out who they are and why. He extended his hand, his palm open, an offer of alliance.
A truce, he said.
A bargain struck in darkness. Until we find the truth. Katerina looked at his hand, her mind reeling. It was a dangerous proposition, an alliance with the man who had destroyed her life. But it was also her only chance, her only hope of survival. She took a deep breath, her decision made. She placed her hand in his, her fingers closing around his. The bargain was struck. The darkness surrounding them seemed to press in, a silent witness to their unlikely pact, forged in the crucible of violence and the ashes of a fallen empire. They were allies now, bound by a shared enemy and a desperate need for the truth. Chapter 8. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The underground chamber felt like a tomb, cold and damp, the silence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from unseen leaks. The single flickering bulb cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, creating an eerie, almost surreal atmosphere. Katerina sat on one of the chairs, her body aching, her mind numb. Veron was pacing the small space, his movements restless, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, a thick, suffocating cloud of questions, suspicions, and unresolved emotions. They had formed a truce, a temporary alliance, but the underlying tension between them remained, a palpable force that crackled like static electricity. Katerina watched Veron, her gaze fixed on his back. She tried to understand him, to decipher the complex web of motivations that drove him. He was a ruthless, dangerous man, a product of a brutal world. But he was also something else. She had seen glimpses of vulnerability, of humanity, beneath his carefully constructed facade. He stopped pacing, turning to face her. His eyes met hers, his gaze intense, probing. "We need to talk, Katerina," he said, his voice low and serious. "We need to understand each other, if we are to survive this." Katerina nodded, her throat tight. She knew he was right. They couldn't continue like this, bound together by a fragile truce, yet separated by a chasm of mistrust and unspoken resentments. "What do you want to know?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Veron sat down on the chair opposite her, his gaze never leaving hers. "I want to know everything," he said. "I want to know about your father, about the Falcone family, about the proposition." Katerina hesitated, her mind racing. How much should she tell him? How much could she trust him? She decided to start with the basics, the information she had gleaned from her father's journal. She told him about her father's growing fear of the Veron family, his desperate attempts to find a way out of their clutches. She told him about the meeting with Donatello Falcone, the proposition, the proposed marriage. Veron listened intently, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question. He simply absorbed her words. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "My father," he said, his voice low and filled with a strange mixture of anger and regret, was a ruthless man. He would have done anything to achieve his goals, even sacrifice his own son. Katerina was surprised by his candor. She hadn't expected him to admit his father's flaws, to acknowledge the darkness that had shaped his own life. "He wanted you to marry me?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Veron nodded. "It was a strategic alliance," he said. "A way to unite our families, to consolidate our power. But it was also something more. My father saw you as a prize, a symbol of his victory over the Bellini family." Katerina felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards the man who had treated her like a pawn in his twisted game. But she also felt a flicker of pity for Veron, for the son who had been forced to live in his father's shadow, to carry the burden of his legacy. "But the marriage never happened," she said, her voice questioning.
"Why?"
Veron hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "Because I refused," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Katerina was stunned. She hadn't expected that. She had assumed that Veron, like his father, would have been willing to do anything to achieve his goals.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. Veron looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, seemingly struggling to find the right words. "Because," he began, his voice halting, "because I couldn't do it. I couldn't marry you, not like that. Not as a conquest." He paused, his gaze searching her face. "I know this may be hard for you to believe, Katerina," he continued, his voice low and earnest, "but I respected you. I admired your strength, your resilience, your spirit." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Katerina stared at him, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to believe. Was he telling the truth? Or was this just another manipulation, another attempt to control her? The weight of unspoken words, of years of rivalry and resentment, of a forced alliance and a burgeoning, impossible attraction, pressed down on them. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled with the echoes of their past and the uncertainties of their future. The flickering bulb above them cast their faces in a stark, revealing light, highlighting the tension, the doubt, and the undeniable spark that flickered between them, despite everything. He had admitted a respect, but she didn't know if she could return it. Not yet. Chapter 9. Masks and Midnight Revelations. Veron's admission hung in the air, a fragile bridge across the chasm that separated them. Katerina studied him, searching his face for any sign of deception, any hint of manipulation. But his expression was open, vulnerable, his dark eyes reflecting a depth of emotion she hadn't seen before. I don't understand, she said, her voice soft, her brow furrowed in confusion. If you respected me, why did you destroy everything? Veron sighed, running a hand through his hair, his gaze shifting away from hers. It's complicated, he said, his voice laced with regret. My father, he was a powerful man, a controlling man. I was trapped. I had to follow his orders, to protect my own family, my own position. But you could have stopped him, Katerina insisted, her voice rising slightly. You could have prevented the fire. The deaths. Veron shook his head, his eyes filled with a haunted look. You don't understand the way things work, Katerina, he said. In our world, there are no choices, only obligations. Loyalty to family is paramount. To defy my father would have been suicide. So you chose to destroy my life instead? Katerina challenged, her anger simmering beneath the surface. Veron met her gaze, his own eyes filled with a mixture of pain and resignation.
I made a choice, he said.
A terrible choice. And I will live with the consequences for the rest of my life. He paused, his gaze holding hers. But I did try to protect you, Katerina, he continued, his voice low and earnest. I spared your life. I made sure you were safe. Safe? Katerina scoffed. Locked in a gilded cage, waiting for you to decide my fate. Veron flinched, as if her words had struck him physically. It wasn't like that, he said. I wanted to give you time. To let you heal. Heal? Katerina repeated, her voice laced with bitterness. How can I heal when my family is dead, my home is destroyed, and my future is uncertain? Veron reached out, his hand hovering over hers, but he didn't touch her. I know I can't undo what I've done, he said. But I can help you. I can protect you. I can give you a new life. Katerina looked at his hand, her mind torn. She wanted to believe him, to trust him. But the scars of the past were too deep, the wounds too fresh. I don't need your protection, she said, her voice cold. I need answers. I need to know who attacked us at the palazzo. And I need to know what my father promised the Falcone family. Veron nodded, his expression grim. We'll find the answers together, Katerina, he said. I promise you that. He stood up, his movements decisive.
We need to leave this place, he said.
It's not safe here anymore. We need to find somewhere secure. Somewhere we can plan our next move. He looked at her, his gaze questioning. Do you trust me, Katerina? He asked, his voice soft, almost pleading. Just enough to get us through this? It was a loaded question, a test. Katerina hesitated, her mind wrestling with conflicting emotions. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, not in this world. But she also knew that she couldn't survive this alone. She needed Veron, his strength, his resources, his knowledge of the underworld. She took a deep breath, her decision made. I don't trust you, Marco, she said, her voice steady. But I need you. And for now, that's enough. Veron nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes.
That's all I ask, he said.
He led her out of the chamber, back into the labyrinth of tunnels. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. The weight of unspoken words still hung heavy between them, but there was also a new understanding, a fragile bond forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual need. As they walked, Katerina's mind drifted back to the ivory falcon, hidden in her satchel. It was the key to unlocking the secrets of her father's pact, the key to finding the Falcone family. She knew she had to use it to contact them, but she couldn't do it with Veron by her side. She needed to find a way to slip away, to make contact on her own terms. An opportunity presented itself sooner than she expected. Veron stopped at a junction in the tunnels, his brow furrowed in concentration. I need to check something, he said. Wait here. I'll be back in a few minutes. He disappeared down one of the tunnels, leaving Katerina alone in the darkness. It was her chance. She quickly retrieved the ivory falcon from her satchel, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find a way to send a message, to alert the Falcone family to her presence, to her need for help.
But how?
She remembered Giovanni's daughter, the young woman who had delivered her father's journal. She had said her father had been a servant at the palazzo. Perhaps she knew other servants, other people who had connections to the Falcone family.
She decided to take a risk.
She found a small piece of charcoal in her satchel, a remnant from the burned library. She carefully wrote a message on a scrap of paper, using the ivory falcon as a symbol, a sign of recognition. The falcon's key seeks its nest. Bellini's daughter lives. Midnight. The Trastevere fountain. She folded the paper, concealing it in her hand. Now, she just needed to find someone to deliver it. She slipped back into the tunnel Marco had taken, hoping that he would lead her, inadvertently, to a contact, or at least back out into the night. The masks they both wore were heavy, but tonight, perhaps, a few truths would be revealed under the Roman moon. Chapter 10. The Price of Redemption's Promise. Caterina followed Verone through the winding tunnels, her senses on high alert. She kept a careful distance, staying in the shadows, making sure he didn't suspect her intentions. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and mildew, the silence broken only by their footsteps and the occasional drip of water. Verone eventually emerged into a hidden courtyard, tucked away behind a row of unassuming buildings. It was a discreet location, known only to a select few, a perfect place for clandestine meetings. A small group of men were waiting in the courtyard, their faces grim, their bodies tense. They were Verone's men, his loyal soldiers, the enforcers of his will. Caterina recognized one of them, a tall, muscular man with a scar across his cheek, who had been present at the Palazzo Bellini the night of the fire. Verone spoke to them in low, hushed tones, his words inaudible to Caterina. But she could sense the urgency in his voice, the tension in his body language. He was clearly giving them instructions, preparing them for something. Caterina saw her opportunity. She slipped away from the group, unnoticed, blending into the shadows. She moved quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find anyone, who could deliver her message to the Falcone family. She spotted a young woman, standing near a doorway, her back to her. She was dressed in simple, dark clothing, her hair pulled back in a tight braid. She looked familiar. Caterina approached her cautiously, her hand clutching the folded message. As she drew closer, she recognized the young woman. It was Giovanni's daughter, the same woman who had delivered her father's journal. "You," Caterina whispered, her voice barely audible. The young woman turned, her eyes widening in surprise.
"Signora Bellini?"
she said, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and recognition. "I need your help," Caterina said, her voice urgent. "I need you to deliver a message for me." The young woman hesitated, her gaze darting nervously towards Verone and his men.
I don't know, she said.
"It's dangerous." "Please," Caterina pleaded, her voice desperate. "It's a matter of life and death. It's about my father and yours." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She remembered her father's sacrifice, his loyalty to the Bellini family. She knew she couldn't refuse. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Caterina quickly explained, showing her the folded message, the ivory falcon symbol. She told her about the meeting place, the Trastevere fountain, the midnight rendezvous. The young woman listened intently, her expression grim. She nodded, her determination hardening. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll deliver your message." Caterina handed her the message, her fingers brushing against the young woman's trembling hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You are very brave." The young woman slipped the message into her pocket, her gaze meeting Caterina's. "Be careful, Signora Bellini," she said. "Verone is a dangerous man." Caterina nodded, her heart heavy. She knew the risks, the dangers, but she had no other choice. She had to trust in the young woman, in the Falcone family, in the hope of a future free from Verone's grasp. She watched as the young woman disappeared into the night, her footsteps fading into the darkness. She was alone again, her fate hanging in the balance. She returned to the courtyard, her movements cautious, her senses on high alert. Verone and his men were still there, their conversation continuing in hushed tones. Verone turned to her, his expression questioning. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Caterina met his gaze, her own expression carefully neutral. "I needed some air," she said, her voice steady. "This place is suffocating." Veron studied her for a moment, his eyes probing, searching. He seemed to sense her deception, her hidden agenda. But he couldn't prove anything. "We're leaving," he said, his voice curt. "We're going to a safe house. Somewhere you'll be comfortable." He didn't offer her his hand this time. He simply turned and walked away, his men following close behind. Katerina followed them, her mind racing. She had set her plan in motion, sent her message to the Falcone family. Now, all she could do was wait. They traveled through the city in a sleek, black car, the same car Veron had used before. They drove in silence, the tension between them palpable. Katerina stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past, her thoughts consumed by the upcoming midnight rendezvous. The safe house turned out to be a luxurious apartment in a secluded, upscale neighborhood. It was a far cry from the underground chamber, but it felt just as much like a prison. Veron had installed guards at the entrance, ensuring she couldn't escape. He offered her a beautifully appointed room, food, a change of clothing, all the comforts of a gilded cage. But a cage, nonetheless. The price of this temporary redemption, this uneasy alliance, was her freedom, at least for now. And she wondered if the Falcone family would even receive her message, let alone answer her call. Chapter 11. Scars of Loyalty, Marks of Betrayal. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Katerina paced the confines of her luxurious prison, her mind a whirlwind of anxieties and calculations. The opulent surroundings, the silk drapes, the antique furniture, the original artwork felt mocking, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within her. She changed into the clothes Veron had provided, a simple but elegant dress that felt alien on her body, a costume for a role she hadn't chosen. She tried to distract herself, to focus on anything other than the impending midnight rendezvous. She examined the books in the apartment's small library. She studied the intricate details of the artwork. She even tried to meditate, but nothing could quell the restless energy that consumed her. As the hour approached, her anticipation grew, tinged with a growing sense of dread. She had placed her trust in Giovanni's daughter, a young woman she barely knew, and in the Falcone family, a powerful, ruthless clan with their own agenda. It was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice. She glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. 11:30. Time was running out. She had to find a way to escape, to slip past the guards Veron had stationed at the entrance. She examined the room, searching for any possible exit, any weakness in the security. The windows were locked, reinforced, impossible to open without attracting attention. The door was her only option. She needed a distraction, a way to divert the guards' attention long enough for her to slip past them. She considered her options, her mind racing. She could try to create a commotion, a fire, a flood. But those were risky, potentially dangerous. Then, she remembered something. Veron had mentioned that the apartment had a private balcony, overlooking a small, secluded garden. Perhaps she could use that to her advantage. She found the balcony doors, concealed behind heavy drapes. She carefully unlocked them, stepping out into the cool night air. The garden was small, enclosed by high walls, but it offered a potential escape route. She examined the walls, searching for any handholds, any weaknesses. They were smooth, unyielding, impossible to climb. But at the far end of the garden, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A large, old tree, its branches extending over the wall, almost touching the roof of a neighboring building. It was a long shot, a dangerous climb, but it was her only chance. She returned to the room, her mind made up. She needed to create a distraction, something that would draw the guards away from the door, giving her time to escape onto the balcony and climb the tree. She found a heavy vase on a side table, a valuable antique. It was a shame to destroy it, but she had no other choice. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She raised the vase above her head, then smashed it against the floor. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the apartment, a loud, jarring noise that was sure to attract attention. She quickly moved to the balcony doors, her heart pounding in her chest. She heard the guards shouting, their footsteps approaching rapidly. She slipped onto the balcony, closing the doors behind her. She rushed to the tree, her movements frantic. She began to climb, her hands grasping the rough bark, her feet finding purchase on the gnarled branches. She heard the guards enter the room, their voices angry, their movements hurried. They discovered the broken vase, their shouts growing louder. Katerina climbed higher, her muscles straining, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached the top of the tree, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She carefully crawled onto the branch that extended over the wall, her heart in her throat. She looked down, the ground a dizzying distance below. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She had to jump. She leaped from the branch, her body flying through the air. She landed on the roof of the neighboring building, her body rolling with the impact. She felt a sharp pain in her ankle, but she ignored it. She had made it. She was free. She quickly scrambled to her feet, her ankle throbbing. She looked back at the apartment building, the lights blazing in the windows. She could see the guards searching the balcony, their figures silhouetted against the light. They hadn't seen her. She had escaped. She limped across the roof, her movements hurried. She found a fire escape, descending it quickly, her heart still pounding. She reached the street, her body shaking. She looked at her watch. 11:50. She had 10 minutes to reach the Trastevere fountain. She began to run, ignoring the pain in her ankle, her mind focused on the midnight rendezvous. The scars of loyalty to a family she barely remembered, and the fresh marks of betrayal by a man she was starting to understand, fueled her desperate flight. She had to reach the fountain. Her future, her freedom depended on it. Chapter 12. A dance on the edge of ruin. The Trastevere fountain was bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, the water cascading gently into the basin, creating a soothing, almost hypnotic sound. The piazza surrounding the fountain was mostly deserted, the usual crowds of tourists and locals having long since dispersed. A few stray cats prowled the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. Katerina arrived, breathless and limping, her ankle throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. She scanned the area, her heart pounding in her chest. She was early, a few minutes before midnight. She found a secluded bench near the fountain, sinking onto it gratefully, her body exhausted. She closed her eyes, taking deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. She had made it. But now, the real test began. Would the Falcone family come? Would they honor her message, her plea for help? Or was she walking into another trap, another betrayal? The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Katerina's anxiety grew, her doubts multiplying. She began to question her decision, her desperate gamble. Then she saw him, a figure emerging from the shadows, approaching the fountain. A tall, imposing man, dressed in a dark suit, his features obscured by the darkness. He moved with a quiet confidence, a sense of authority that made her heart skip a beat. He stopped a few feet away from her, his gaze fixed on her. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she could sense his power, his intensity.
Signora Bellini?
He asked, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. Katerina nodded, her throat tight. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The man stepped closer, his features coming into focus. He was older than Verone, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. He had a strong, weathered face, marked by years of experience, of hardship, of command. This was Donatello Falcone. I received your message, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The Ivory Falcon. A bold move. Katerina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and desperation. I need your help, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Falcone studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. You are Antonio Bellini's daughter, he said, his voice a statement, not a question. He offered you to me as a bride, a guarantee of peace between our families. Katerina nodded, her heart sinking. She had hoped he wouldn't remember, that the proposition had been forgotten. But the marriage never happened, Falcone continued, his voice laced with a hint of something. Curiosity? Regret? Verone intervened, Katerina said, her voice bitter. He destroyed my family, my home, everything. Falcone's expression remained unchanged, his eyes fixed on her. And now you seek my protection? He asked, his voice neutral. I seek justice, Katerina corrected, her voice gaining strength. I seek revenge. And I believe we can help each other. Falcone smiled, a faint, wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You are your father's daughter, he said. Bold, ambitious, and perhaps a little foolish. He paused, his gaze holding hers. What do you propose, Signora Bellini? He asked, his voice low and serious. Katerina took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. I know who attacked us at the palazzo, she said. It wasn't your men. It was someone else. Someone who wants both Verone and me dead. Falcone's eyes narrowed, his interest piqued. And who is this someone? He asked. Katerina hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't reveal everything, not yet. She needed to keep some leverage, some control. I'm not sure, she said, her voice carefully neutral. But I have a clue. A name. A name that was mentioned in my father's journal. She paused for effect. The name is Rossi. Falcone's expression changed, a flicker of surprise, of recognition, in his eyes. Rossi, he repeated, his voice thoughtful. The Rossi family. A minor player, but ambitious. And ruthless. He looked at Katerina, his gaze intense. What makes you think they are involved? He asked. Katerina explained about the cryptic entries in her father's journal, the growing fear of a new threat, the mention of Rossi's name in connection with a series of incidents. Falcone listened intently, his expression grim. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her credibility. This is a dangerous game, Signora Bellini, he said, his voice low and warning. The Rossi family are not to be trifled with. They have powerful allies, connections in high places. I know, Katerina said, her voice unwavering. But I'm not afraid. I have nothing left to lose. Falcone studied her for a moment, his gaze searching, probing. He seemed to see something in her, something that impressed him. Very well, Signora Bellini, he said, his voice decisive. I will help you. But on my terms. This was a dance on the edge of ruin, a delicate negotiation between two powerful forces, with her caught in the middle. She had offered a name, a clue, but the price of his alliance, his protection, was yet to be revealed. And she had a feeling it would be steep. Chapter 13. The Unveiling of Hidden Truths. Falcone's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. On my terms. Katerina knew what that meant. It meant she would be indebted to him, bound to his will, a pawn in his game, just as she had been with Verone. But this time, she hoped, the game would be different. This time, she would be playing for her own survival, her own revenge. What are your terms, Don Falcone? She asked, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. Falcone smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down her spine. Patience, Signora Bellini, he said. All will be revealed in time. For now, you will come with me. You will be my guest. Katerina hesitated, her mind racing. She had no choice, really. She was alone, vulnerable, hunted by both Verone and the Rossi family. Falcone offered protection, resources, a chance to fight back. But it was a devil's bargain, a pact with a man even more ruthless than Verone. Where will you take me? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. To a safe place, Falcone said, his voice evasive. Somewhere you will be comfortable, and where we can discuss our future collaboration. He gestured towards a dark car parked nearby, its engine idling. Shall we? Katerina took a deep breath, her decision made. She nodded, her heart heavy with apprehension. She walked towards the car, Falcone following close behind. They drove in silence, the city lights blurring past, the tension between them palpable. Katerina stared out the window, her mind a whirlwind of anxieties and calculations. She had escaped Verone's clutches, only to fall into Falcone's. She was a prisoner once again, albeit a prisoner with a powerful, albeit dangerous, ally. The car eventually arrived at a secluded villa, nestled in the hills overlooking Rome. It was a magnificent estate, surrounded by high walls and lush gardens, a fortress of opulence and power. This was Falcone's domain, his sanctuary, his seat of command. Falcone led her inside, the villa's interior even more opulent than the exterior. Marble floors, antique furniture, priceless artwork, it was a display of wealth and power that was both impressive and intimidating. He led her to a spacious, elegantly furnished room, overlooking the gardens. "This will be your quarters," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will be comfortable here." He paused, his gaze fixed on her.
"We will talk in the morning," he said.
"After you have rested. And after I have made some inquiries." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "One more thing, Signora Bellini," he said, his voice low and serious. "Do not attempt to escape. It would be unwise." He left, closing the door behind him, the sound echoing in the silent room. Caterina was alone again, a prisoner in a gilded cage, her fate hanging in the balance. She examined the room, searching for any sign of surveillance, any hidden cameras or microphones. She found nothing obvious, but she knew Falcone was a cautious man, a master of deception. He would be watching her, listening to her, even if she couldn't see him. She sat down on the bed, her body exhausted, her mind numb. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, a sense of hopelessness that threatened to engulf her. She had traded one captor for another, one prison for another. But then, she remembered her father's journal, the Ivory Falcon, the message she had sent to Giovanni's daughter. She still had a glimmer of hope, a chance of reclaiming her freedom, her future. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer. A prayer for strength, for guidance, for a way out of this labyrinth of deceit and betrayal. The next morning, Caterina was summoned to Falcone's study. It was a large, imposing room, lined with bookshelves, dominated by a massive desk. Falcone was sitting behind the desk, his expression grim. "I have made some inquiries," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "About the Rossi family. And about your allegations." Caterina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with anticipation.
"And?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Falcone leaned back in his chair, his gaze holding hers. "It seems you were right, Signora Bellini," he said. "The Rossi family are indeed ambitious. And they have been making moves, consolidating their power, forming alliances." He paused, his gaze intense. "But there is more," he continued. "Something unexpected. Something that connects them to your father and to Verone." Caterina's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" she asked, her voice urgent. Falcone leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "It seems your father, Antonio Bellini, was involved in a secret deal. A deal with both the Rossi family and Lorenzo Verone, Marco's father." Caterina was stunned. "A deal?" she repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. "What kind of deal?" Falcone hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "A deal involving a significant sum of money," he said. "And something else. Something more valuable."
"What?"
Caterina demanded, her voice rising. "What was it?" Falcone looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, seemingly struggling to find the right words. And then he uttered two words that shattered all her previous assumptions. Two words that would redefine the entire conflict.
"Stolen artifacts," he said.
The unveiling of this hidden truth, this secret alliance between her father, Verone's father, and the Rossi family, changed everything. It was no longer a simple rivalry, a feud between two families. It was a conspiracy, a web of deceit that reached far deeper than she had ever imagined. And she was caught in the middle of it, a pawn in a game she didn't even understand. Chapter 14. Echoes through the catacombs of memory. Stolen artifacts. The words echoed in Caterina's mind, a revelation that shattered her understanding of the conflict, of her father's legacy, of everything she thought she knew. It was a twist she hadn't anticipated, a hidden layer of deceit that added a new dimension to the already complex web of rivalries and betrayals. "What kind of artifacts?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her mind reeling. Falcone leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back into the past.
"Ancient artifacts," he said.
"Roman relics, of immense historical and cultural value. Priceless treasures, hidden for centuries." He paused, his gaze returning to Caterina. "Your father, along with Lorenzo Verone and the head of the Rossi family, discovered a hidden chamber. A secret catacomb, beneath the old Palazzo Bellini." Caterina was stunned. A secret catacomb, beneath her family's ancestral home? It seemed impossible, a story from a legend, not reality. But Falcone's words had the ring of truth, a chilling resonance that she couldn't ignore. "And they stole the artifacts?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Falcone nodded. "They formed a pact. A secret alliance to excavate the catacomb, to steal the artifacts, and to sell them on the black market for an enormous profit."
"But why?"
Caterina asked, her voice trembling. "Why would my father do such a thing? He was a respected man, a man of honor." Falcone smiled, a cold, cynical smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Honor, Signora Bellini, is a luxury few can afford in our world," he said. "Your father was a desperate man. He was facing financial ruin, political pressure, threats from his enemies. The artifacts offered him a way out, a chance to reclaim his power, his wealth." "And Verone?" Caterina asked, her voice filled with a growing sense of anger, of betrayal. "What was his role in this?" "Lorenzo Verone was the mastermind," Falcone said. "He orchestrated the entire operation. He provided the funding, the resources, the connections. He was the driving force behind the theft." "And Marco?" Caterina asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did he know?" Falcone hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers.
"That I am not sure," he said.
"Marco was young then, still learning the ropes. But he was his father's son. He would have known something." Caterina felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The man she had saved, the man she had formed an uneasy alliance with, was potentially complicit in this sacrilege. He had destroyed her family, her home, her future. All for what? Greed? Power? And the Rossi family? She asked, her voice trembling with rage.
"What happened to them?"
"They were betrayed," Falcone said. "Lorenzo Verone, true to his nature, double-crossed them. He took the artifacts, the money, everything. He left them with nothing. So that's why they're hunting us," Caterina said, her voice filled with understanding. "They want revenge. They want what they believe is rightfully theirs." Falcone nodded.
"They want the artifacts," he said.
"And they believe you know where they are." Caterina's mind raced. The artifacts. The key to everything. The reason for the fire, the deaths, the betrayals. But where were they? If they were hidden in a secret catacomb beneath the Palazzo Bellini, they were surely destroyed in the fire. Unless a sudden thought occurred to her, a flicker of memory from her childhood. She remembered exploring the palazzo as a young girl, playing hide and seek with her cousins. She remembered a hidden passage, a secret room, behind a bookcase in the library. Could it be? Could the catacomb be accessed from that secret room? Could the artifacts still be there, hidden beneath the rubble, untouched by the flames? She looked at Falcone, her eyes filled with a new determination. "I think I know where they are," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. Falcone leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Where?" he asked, his voice urgent. Caterina hesitated, her mind wrestling with conflicting emotions. She was about to reveal a secret that could change everything. But could she trust Falcone? Could she trust anyone? She took a breath. There was a hidden passage in the library, behind a bookcase. I used to play there as a child. It may lead to these catacombs. A flicker of something satisfaction, perhaps, crossed Falcone's face. "We must go there," he stated, his voice laced with steel. "Tonight." The weight of the past, the echoes of betrayal, The promise of a dangerous confrontation all converged on that single point in time. Tonight, back to the ruins of her home, to the heart of the mystery, to a place filled with ghosts and, perhaps, the answers she so desperately sought. The catacombs of memory were about to be opened, and she had no idea what horrors, or what truths, lay within. Chapter 15. The Lion and the Fallen Queen. The return to the Palazzo Bellini was a journey into the heart of darkness, a descent into the ashes of Caterina's past. The once proud structure loomed before them, a skeletal silhouette against the night sky, a monument to destruction and betrayal. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and decay, a constant reminder of the inferno that had consumed her life. Falcone had assembled a small team of his most trusted men, heavily armed and prepared for anything. They moved with a quiet efficiency, their movements precise and coordinated, like a well-oiled machine. Caterina felt a mixture of fear and anticipation, a sense of dread mingled with a flicker of hope. They entered the palazzo through the same broken window Caterina had used before, her movements more confident this time, her fear tempered by a growing sense of determination. The interior was even more desolate than she remembered, the darkness deeper, the silence more profound. Falcone led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating the charred remains of her former life. They moved slowly, carefully, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. They reached the library, or rather, what was left of it. The walls were blackened, the bookshelves collapsed, the books themselves reduced to piles of ash. But the outline of the room was still visible, the ghosts of its former grandeur haunting the darkness. Caterina pointed towards the far wall, where the bookcase had once stood. "There," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Behind where the bookcase was. There's a hidden passage." Falcone's men quickly cleared away the rubble, their movements swift and efficient. They found the outline of a door, concealed behind a layer of charred wood and plaster. It was locked, but one of Falcone's men, a specialist in such matters, quickly picked the lock, his tools clicking softly in the silence. The door swung open, revealing a narrow, dark passage, descending into the depths of the earth. The air that wafted from the opening was cold and damp, carrying the scent of ancient stone and something else, something metallic. Falcone turned to Caterina, his gaze intense. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "This could be a trap. The Rossi family, Veron, they could be waiting for us." Caterina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. "I have to do this. I have to find the truth." Falcone nodded, his expression grim. He gestured to his men, and they began to descend into the passage, their flashlights illuminating the narrow, winding staircase. Caterina followed close behind Falcone, her heart pounding in her chest. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, as they descended into the earth. The passage twisted and turned, leading them deeper and deeper into the darkness. They eventually reached a large, underground chamber, a vast, cavernous space that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with dust, the silence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from unseen leaks. Falcone's men spread out, their flashlights scanning the chamber, searching for any sign of danger, any clue to the artifact's location. Caterina stood beside Falcone, her eyes wide with awe and apprehension. This was the secret catacomb, the hidden chamber her father had discovered, the place where he had made his fatal pact. And then she saw it. In the center of the chamber, resting on a raised platform, was a collection of objects, covered in dust and cobwebs, but still recognizable. Roman relics, ancient artifacts of immense historical and cultural value. Golden chalices, intricately carved statues, jeweled daggers, ancient scrolls. It was a treasure trove of unimaginable wealth and beauty. Caterina felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a mixture of grief, anger, and wonder. These were the objects that had caused so much pain, so much destruction. These were the artifacts that had cost her father his life, her family their legacy. Falcone approached the platform, his gaze fixed on the artifacts. He reached out, his hand hovering over a golden chalice, his fingers tracing its intricate carvings. "Magnificent," he murmured, his voice filled with awe. "Priceless." He turned to Caterina, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. "You have done well, Signora Bellini," he said. "You have led me to a treasure beyond my wildest dreams." His words sent a chill down Caterina's spine. She had trusted him, believed in his promise of justice, of revenge. But now, she saw a different side of him, a side driven by greed, by a lust for power. She had been a fool. She had walked into another trap, deliver herself into the hands of another predator. She was caught between the lion, Falcone, and the fallen queen, herself, with the spoils of a ruined empire lying between them. And she had a terrible feeling that she was about to lose everything, again. Chapter 16. Between the shadows of fear and desire. Falcone's words echoed in the cavernous chamber, a chilling reminder of the precariousness of Caterina's position. She had led him to the artifacts, fulfilled her part of the bargain, but now she was at his mercy, a pawn in his game, just as she had feared. "What happens now, Don Falcone?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, trying to mask her fear with a semblance of defiance. Falcone turned to her, his expression unreadable, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Now," he said, his voice soft, almost seductive, "we celebrate our success." He gestured to his men, who had been standing guard, their weapons at the ready. "Bring the refreshments," he ordered. Two of his men disappeared into the shadows, returning moments later carrying a small table, chairs, and a bottle of wine, along with 2 glasses. It was a surreal scene, a bizarre tableau of civility amidst the darkness and the dust of the ancient catacomb. Falcone set up the table near the platform, placing the wine and glasses on it. He poured 2 glasses, offering one to Caterina. "Join me, Signora Bellini," he said, his voice smooth, inviting. "Let us toast to our new partnership." Caterina hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't trust him, not one bit. But she also knew she couldn't refuse, not without risking his wrath. She had to play along, to bide her time, to find a way to escape this gilded cage. She took the glass, her hand trembling slightly. She met Falcone's gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something she couldn't quite define. Falcone raised his glass, his eyes fixed on her. "To the future," he said, his voice low and resonant. "To a future of wealth, power, and collaboration." He took a sip of his wine, his gaze never leaving hers. Caterina mirrored his action, taking a small sip of the wine, her senses on high alert. It was a rich, full-bodied red, a vintage she recognized as one of her father's favorites. The irony was not lost on her. She was drinking her father's wine, in a secret catacomb beneath her family's ruined home, with the man who had orchestrated its destruction, and who was now holding her captive. "You are a remarkable woman, Caterina," Falcone said, breaking the silence. "Intelligent, resourceful, and beautiful." His words, his tone, sent a shiver down her spine. It was a compliment, yes, but also a threat, a reminder of her vulnerability, of his power over her. She decided to steer. "Tell me more about this deal," she said, keeping her voice level. "Between my father, Lorenzo, and Rossi." Falcone smiled. "Curiosity is a dangerous trait, Cara. I have a right to know," Caterina said, more boldly than she felt. "My father's choices have placed me here. I deserve the truth." Falcone considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "Very well. Your father, as I said, was desperate. Lorenzo Verone offered him a way out, promising riches beyond his dreams. Rossi provided the expertise. He was an archaeologist of sorts. He knew of the legends, of the rumored catacombs beneath Rome. He had spent years searching for them. And my father, he agreed to this theft? He did. For the promise of a new beginning, a restored Bellini empire. But Lorenzo, as always, had other plans. He betrayed Rossi, taking the lion's share of the artifacts for himself. He intended to sell them slowly over time to avoid attracting attention. But he died before he could realize his full plan.
And Marco?
Katerina asked, the question burning in her mind. Where does he fit into all of this? Falcone hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Marco is a complication, he said. He claims he knew nothing of his father's dealings. But I have my doubts. He took another sip of his wine, then fixed his eyes on her. The shift was so sudden, she almost flinched. But none of that matters now. What matters is that we have the artifacts. He reached out, took her hand, his thumb stroking softly. Katerina felt trapped, caught between the shadows of fear and a burgeoning, unwanted, and undeniably dangerous desire. Falcone was a predator, a powerful, ruthless man. But he was also fascinating. His intelligence, his charisma, his sheer force of will were undeniably attractive. It was a terrifying realization, a dangerous game she was playing, dancing on the edge of an abyss. She had to escape, to find a way out, before she lost herself completely.
But how?
She was surrounded by his men, trapped in a secret catacomb, with no apparent way out. She needed a miracle, a stroke of luck, a desperate gamble. And, as if summoned by her thoughts, a distant sound broke the silence. A faint, muffled rumble, coming from somewhere deep within the catacombs. It wasn't natural. It was something else. Chapter 17. A tapestry woven with secrets. The rumbling grew louder, closer, shaking the very foundations of the ancient catacomb. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling, adding to the already palpable sense of unease. Falcone's men tensed, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons.
What is that?
Katerina asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide with alarm. Falcone frowned, his expression a mixture of annoyance and concern. I don't know, he said, his voice curt. But it's not natural. He turned to one of his men, a tall, muscular man with a scar across his cheek, the same man Katerina had seen at the Palazzo Bellini the night of the fire. Go, he ordered. Find out what's happening. The man nodded, disappearing into the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The rumbling continued, growing even louder, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Katerina felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct to flee. But where could she go? She was trapped, deep underground, surrounded by Falcone's men. She looked at Falcone, her eyes searching his face. He seemed unnerved. This wasn't part of his plan. This was something unexpected, something beyond his control. Suddenly, the man who had gone to investigate returned, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. It's them. He stammered, his voice trembling. The Rossi family. They're collapsing the tunnels. Falcone's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. How many? He demanded. I don't know, the man said. Dozens, maybe more. They're using explosives. Explosives. The rumbling, the shaking, the dust falling from the ceiling, it all made sense now. The Rossi family were collapsing the tunnels, trapping them underground, burying them alive. It was a desperate, ruthless move, a suicide mission. They were willing to die as long as they took Falcone and the artifacts with them. Falcone turned to Katerina, his gaze intense. It seems our celebration has been cut short, he said, his voice laced with a grim irony. We need to leave.
Now.
He gestured to his men, and they began to move, their movements swift and efficient. They grabbed the artifacts, carefully placing them in protective cases. But as they prepared to leave, another explosion rocked the chamber, even larger than the previous ones. The ceiling cracked, large chunks of stone falling to the ground. Katerina screamed, ducking for cover. She felt a sharp pain in her arm as a piece of falling debris struck her. Falcone grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet.
Come on,
he yelled, his voice urgent. We have to get out of here. They ran, following Falcone's men, their footsteps echoing in the collapsing tunnel. The ground was shaking violently, the air thick with dust and smoke. They reached the narrow passage they had used to enter the chamber, the only way out. But as they approached, another explosion ripped through the tunnel, blocking the entrance with a massive pile of rubble. They were trapped. Katerina felt a wave of despair wash over her, a sense of hopelessness that threatened to engulf her. This was it. This was the end. She was going to die, buried alive in a secret catacomb, beneath the ruins of her family's home. Falcone stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted. His carefully laid plans, his ambitions, his dreams of power and wealth were all crumbling around him. He looked at Katerina, his gaze filled with a complex mixture of emotions. Regret, resignation, and something else. Something that looked almost like tenderness. "I'm sorry, Katerina," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I never meant for this to happen." His words surprised her. She hadn't expected an apology, an admission of failure, from a man like Falcone. But there was no time for recriminations, no time for regrets. They had to find another way out, or they would die. Katerina looked around the collapsing chamber, her mind racing. She remembered the hidden passage in the library, the one she had used to play hide and seek as a child. It had led to this chamber, to the catacomb. But was there another way out? Another passage? Another exit? She remembered exploring the catacombs with her cousins, venturing deeper into the darkness, discovering new chambers, new tunnels. There had been rumors, whispers of a secret network of passages, stretching for miles beneath the city. "There might be another way," she said, her voice trembling with a flicker of hope.
Un secret passage.
"I remember exploring these catacombs as a child. There were rumors." Falcone looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of skepticism and desperation. "Rumors?" he repeated, his voice doubtful. "We don't have time for children's games, Katerina." "It's our only chance," Katerina insisted, her voice gaining strength. "We have to try." Falcone hesitated, his mind wrestling with the decision. He looked at his men, their faces pale and drawn, their hope fading. He looked at the collapsing chamber, the blocked entrance, the inevitable end. He took a deep breath, his decision made. "Very well," he said, his voice resigned. "Lead the way, Katerina. Lead the way." The tapestry woven with secrets was unraveling, thread by thread, revealing a desperate, final gamble. They were trapped between the collapsing tunnels and a fading hope, with only a child's memory to guide them. Chapter 18. The storm breaks over Palazzo Vento. Katerina led the way, her mind racing, her memory straining to recall the details of her childhood explorations. She remembered a faint draft, a sense of openness, in one particular corner of the chamber. A place where the air felt different. She moved towards that corner, her flashlight beam cutting through the dust-filled air. Falcone and his men followed close behind, their footsteps echoing in the collapsing chamber. She reached the corner, her hands searching the walls, feeling for any sign of an opening, a crack, a hidden passage. The stone was cold and smooth, seemingly impenetrable. But then she felt it. A slight indentation, a subtle shift in the texture of the stone. She pressed her hand against it, pushing with all her might. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow, dark passage, hidden behind a cleverly disguised stone door. It was a secret entrance, known only to a few, forgotten by time. Katerina felt a surge of relief, a flicker of hope. She had found it. She had remembered. "This way," she shouted, her voice echoing in the passage. Falcone and his men rushed towards the opening, their movements frantic. They squeezed through the narrow passage, disappearing into the darkness. Katerina followed, her heart pounding in her chest. The passage was narrow and winding, descending even deeper into the earth. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of ancient stone and something else, something earthy. They walked in silence, their flashlights illuminating the way. The rumbling of the collapsing tunnels grew fainter, more distant, as they moved further away from the main chamber. They eventually reached another chamber, smaller than the previous one, but still large enough to hold them all. It was empty, devoid of artifacts, but there were several other passages leading out of it, offering multiple escape routes. Falcone turned to Katerina, his expression a mixture of relief and admiration. "You saved us, Katerina," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You remembered." Katerina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. She had saved them, yes, but she was still trapped, still at Falcone's mercy. "Where do these passages lead?" she asked, her voice cautious. Falcone shrugged.
I don't know, he said.
"These catacombs are a labyrinth. They stretch for miles beneath the city. They could lead anywhere." He paused, his gaze intense. "We need to split up," he continued. "It's too dangerous to stay together. We'll increase our chances of finding a way out." He divided his men into smaller groups, assigning each group a different passage. He kept Katerina by his side, his hand resting on her arm, a possessive gesture that sent a shiver down her spine. "You and I will take this passage," he said, pointing to one of the tunnels. "It seems the most promising." Katerina nodded, her heart heavy with apprehension. She was alone again with Falcone, trapped in a dark, underground labyrinth, with no idea where they were going or what awaited them. They began to walk, their footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. The silence was broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water from unseen leaks and the occasional scuttling of unseen creatures. As they walked, Katerina's mind drifted back to Veron. She wondered if he was still alive, if he had escaped the collapsing tunnels.
She felt a pang of something.
Regret? Guilt? She couldn't quite define it. She had saved his life once. She had formed an uneasy alliance with him. But he was still her enemy, the man who had destroyed her family, her home. And yet, she couldn't deny the strange connection she felt with him, the undeniable attraction that simmered beneath the surface of their animosity. Suddenly, Falcone stopped. He held up his hand, signaling her to be silent. He listened intently, his head cocked to one side. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Katerina listened. She could hear a faint sound, coming from somewhere ahead of them. It was a rhythmic thumping like a heartbeat. They moved forward cautiously, their flashlights illuminating the passage. The sound grew louder, closer. They rounded a corner, and then they saw it. A large, metal door, set into the wall of the passage. The thumping sound was coming from behind the door. Falcone approached the door, his hand reaching for his weapon. He listened again, his ear pressed against the metal. "Someone's inside," he whispered. "And they're trying to get out." He turned to Katerina, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. "It seems our luck has changed, Signora Bellini," he said. "We may have found a way out. And a prisoner." He signaled to his men, and they began to work on the door, trying to force it open. The thumping from inside grew louder, more frantic. It was Veron. Katerina knew it, instinctively. He was trapped just as she was. She had a decision to make, another one in a long line of impossible choices. She could help Falcone capture Veron, delivering her enemy into his hands. Or she could try to help Veron escape, risking Falcone's wrath and her own safety. The metal door yielded to the expertise of Falcone's man. The door swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit chamber. And inside, his face bruised and bloodied, his clothes torn and covered in dust, was Marco Veron. Above them, unbeknownst to those trapped below, the storm that had been brewing all day finally broke. Rain lashed against the ancient stones of Rome, thunder echoing like the wrath of forgotten gods. The storm, mirroring the turmoil below, was a sign, an omen. The game was changing, the players were shifting, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 19. Blood on the cobblestones, tears in the rain. Veron stared at them, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in anger. He was unarmed, his hands bound behind his back, his face bruised and bloodied. He looked defeated. "Katerina?" he said, his voice hoarse, disbelieving. What are you doing here?" Katerina met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. She felt a pang of something. Pity? Relief? She couldn't quite define it. Falcone stepped forward, a cruel smile playing on his lips. Well, 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 he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look what we have here. The prodigal son returns. Veron glared at him, his hatred palpable. Falcone, he spat, his voice filled with venom. I should have known you'd be involved in this. Falcone chuckled, a low, menacing sound. You were always a disappointment, Marco, he said. Weak, impulsive, easily manipulated. Just like your father. Veron struggled against his bonds, his face contorted with rage. You set us up, he accused. You betrayed us, just like you betrayed my father. Falcone's smile widened. Betrayal is a family tradition, Marco, he said. You should know that by now. He turned to Caterina, his gaze intense. It seems our paths have crossed again, Signora Bellini, he said. And this time fate has delivered your enemy into my hands. Caterina felt a chill run down her spine. She had wanted revenge, yes, but this was different. This was cold-blooded, calculated, cruel. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Falcone shrugged. What do you think? He said. He has information I need. And then he will be disposed of. Veron looked at Caterina, his eyes pleading. Caterina, please, he begged. You have to help me. He'll kill me. Caterina's heart was torn. She hated Veron, yes, but she also remembered the night at the Palazzo Bellini, when she had saved his life. She remembered the uneasy alliance they had formed, the shared danger they had faced. She couldn't just stand by and watch him be murdered. No, she said, her voice gaining strength. I won't let you do this, Falcone. Falcone turned to her, his expression incredulous. You dare defy me? He said, his voice dangerously low. He's unarmed, Caterina said, her voice unwavering. He's a prisoner. You can't just execute him. Falcone's eyes narrowed, his anger rising. You forget your place, Signora Bellini, he said. You are my guest, my pawn. You have no say in this. He gestured to his men, who moved towards Veron, their weapons raised. Caterina knew she had to act quickly. She stepped in front of Veron, shielding him with her body. Stop, she cried, her voice echoing in the chamber. If you want the artifacts, if you want my cooperation, you will not harm him. Falcone stared at her, his face a mask of fury. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating the risks. You are playing a dangerous game, Caterina, he said, his voice a low growl. So are you, Caterina retorted, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, the tension in the chamber thick and heavy. Falcone's men were poised to strike. Veron was helpless, and Caterina was caught in the middle, her fate hanging in the balance. Suddenly, a new sound broke the silence. The sound of footsteps, approaching rapidly from the passage they had used to enter the chamber. Falcone turned, his eyes narrowed, his hand reaching for his weapon. A group of figures emerged from the darkness, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. It was the Rossi family. They had found them. The leader of the group, a tall, imposing woman with fiery red hair and piercing green eyes, stepped forward. Falcone, she said, her voice cold and hard. We meet again. Falcone smiled, a cruel, defiant smile. Alessandra, he said. I was wondering when you'd show up. You have something that belongs to us, Alessandra Rossi said, her voice unwavering. The artifacts. And we're here to take them back. You'll have to kill me first, Falcone retorted, his hand tightening around his weapon. That, Alessandra said, her smile widening, can be arranged. The chamber erupted in chaos. Gunfire echoed through the confined space, bullets flying, men shouting, bodies falling. Caterina found herself caught in the crossfire, trapped between three warring factions. She ducked for cover, shielding herself behind a fallen pillar, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw Veron, still bound, struggling to free himself. She saw Falcone, firing his weapon, his face a mask of fury. She saw Alessandra Rossi, leading her men, her eyes filled with a cold, ruthless determination. The battle raged on, a brutal, chaotic struggle for power, for revenge, for the artifacts. Katerina knew she had to get out of there, to escape the carnage.
But how?
She crawled along the floor, staying low, trying to avoid the flying bullets. She reached Veron, who was still struggling with his bonds. "I'll help you," she whispered, her voice urgent. She quickly untied his hands, freeing him from his captivity. Veron looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. "Thank you, Katerina," he said, his voice hoarse. I owe you my life." "We need to get out of here," Katerina said, her voice urgent.
Now.
They crawled together, staying low, moving towards the passage that led back to the main catacomb. The gunfire continued, the chaos escalating. They were almost to relative safety of a smaller passage when a stray bullet, with no allegiance, struck Veron in the back. He cried out, collapsing to the ground. Outside the catacombs, the rain was coming down harder now, and the cobblestone streets of Rome were soon stained with runnels of blood. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Katerina screamed, her voice echoing through the chaotic chamber. She rushed to Veron's side, her hands trembling as she tried to assess the damage. The bullet had struck him in the lower back, near his spine. He was bleeding profusely, his face pale, his breathing shallow. "Marco," she cried, her voice filled with panic. "Stay with me. Don't you dare die on me." Veron looked at her, his eyes filled with pain, but also something else. A flicker of tenderness? "Katerina," he whispered, his voice weak, his breath ragged. "I am sorry for everything. Don't talk," Katerina said, her voice choked with emotion. "Save your strength. We're going to get you out of here." She tried to lift him, to help him move, but he was too heavy, his body limp. She couldn't do it alone. The battle was still raging around them, the gunfire echoing, the bodies falling. Falcone and Alessandro Rossi were locked in a fierce struggle, their hatred for each other palpable. Katerina looked around desperately, searching for help. But Falcone's men were either dead or engaged in combat, and the Rossi family were their enemies. She was alone. She had to save Veron, but she didn't know how. Suddenly, she saw a figure moving towards them, dodging the bullets, weaving through the chaos. It was one of Falcone's men, the one who had picked the lock on the secret passage, the one who had shown a flicker of kindness towards her earlier.
"You,"
Katerina cried, her voice desperate.
"help me, please."
The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Katerina and Falcone, who was still engaged in combat with Alessandro Rossi. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating the risks. Then he made a decision. He rushed to Katerina's side, helping her lift Veron. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent.
"Now."
"There's another passage, a secret exit. I know the way." Together, they carried Veron, his body heavy and limp, towards the passage the man had indicated. They moved quickly, dodging the bullets, weaving through the chaos. They reached the passage, a narrow, dark tunnel that led away from the main chamber. They entered, the sounds of the battle fading behind them. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the narrow tunnel. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of ancient stone and blood. Veron was losing consciousness, his breathing growing shallower, his pulse weaker. Katerina knew they had to get him help, quickly. They eventually reached the end of the passage, a small, hidden opening that led to the surface. They emerged into the cool night air, the rain still falling, the streets of Rome deserted. The man, whose name Katerina later learned was Lorenzo, a cruel irony, given the circumstances, helped her carry Veron to a nearby alley, a secluded place where they could rest and assess their situation. Veron was barely conscious, his body trembling. Katerina tore strips of fabric from her dress, trying to stem the bleeding, her hands shaking. "We need to get him to a doctor," she said, her voice desperate. "He's going to die." Lorenzo nodded, his expression grim. "I know a place," he said. A discreet clinic. They won't ask questions." He helped Katerina lift Veron again, and they began to walk, their movements slow and painful. They moved through the dark, deserted streets, the rain washing away the blood, the tears, the grime of the battle. They eventually reached the clinic, a small, unassuming building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. Lorenzo spoke to the doctor, a stern-faced woman with tired eyes, explaining the situation in hushed tones. The doctor examined Verone, her expression grim.
He's lost a lot of blood, she said.
He needs surgery immediately. She prepared Verone for surgery, her movements swift and efficient. Caterina and Lorenzo waited outside the operating room, their hearts heavy with apprehension. The hours crawled by, each one feeling like an eternity. Caterina paced the waiting room, her mind a whirlwind of anxieties and regrets. She had saved Verone's life, again, but she didn't know if it was enough. She thought about Falcone, about Alessandro Rossi, about the artifacts, about the bloody battle in the catacombs. She had escaped, but at what cost? Finally, the doctor emerged from the operating room, her expression tired but hopeful.
He's stable, she said.
The surgery was successful. He'll live. Caterina felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. She had saved him. He was alive. She looked at Lorenzo, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved us both." Lorenzo nodded, his expression humble. "It was the right thing to do," he said. "Falcone, he was a bad man. He deserved what he got." Caterina later learned that Falcone and Alessandro Rossi had both died in the catacombs, their battle ending in a mutual kill. The artifacts were lost, buried beneath the rubble, their secrets remaining hidden. The final confrontation had been a maelstrom of hearts and loyalties, a bloody climax to a story woven with secrets, betrayal, and a desperate search for redemption. Caterina had survived, but she was forever changed, scarred by the events, haunted by the memories. And she knew that her journey was far from over. Verone was alive, but their future, their relationship, was uncertain. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood on the cobblestones, but not the stains on their souls. Epilogue. The sun rose over Rome, casting a golden glow on the ancient city, a promise of a new day, a fresh start. Caterina stood on the balcony of a small, unassuming apartment in the Trastevere district, the same apartment she had fled 2 weeks ago, after the fire that had destroyed her home, her family, her life. It felt like a lifetime ago. She had returned to the apartment after Verone's surgery, after she had ensured his safety, his recovery. She had needed time, space to think, to heal, to decide her future. Verone was recovering in a private clinic, under a false name, protected by Lorenzo and a few other loyal men who had defected from Falcone's organization. He was still weak, still recovering from his injuries, but he was alive. Caterina had visited him every day, watching over him, tending to his wounds, talking to him, even when he was unconscious. She had felt a strange connection to him, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger, of mutual survival. She had also felt something else. Something she couldn't quite define, something that both terrified and fascinated her. An attraction, a desire, that simmered beneath the surface of their complicated history, their animosity, their shared pain. She had learned more about Verone during his recovery, about his childhood, his upbringing, his relationship with his father, the late Lorenzo Verone. She had learned that he had been trapped, just as she had been, a pawn in his father's twisted game. He had been forced to follow his father's orders, to participate in the family's criminal activities, to betray his own conscience, his own sense of morality. He had hated it, he had resented it, but he had felt powerless to change it. He had tried to protect Caterina, in his own way, by sparing her life, by offering her a gilded cage, a life of luxury and privilege, in exchange for her submission. It had been a misguided attempt, a flawed gesture, but it had been born of a genuine respect? Affection? Caterina didn't know. She was still trying to understand him, to decipher the complex web of motivations that drove him. She had also learned the truth about the artifacts, about her father's involvement in the secret deal with Lorenzo Verone and the Rossi family. It had been a painful revelation, a shattering of her illusions about her father, her family, her legacy. But it had also been a liberation. She was no longer bound by the past, by the sins of her father, by the expectations of her family. She was free to create her own future, to forge her own path. She had decided to leave Rome, to start a new life, somewhere far away from the violence, the corruption, the betrayals that had defined her past. She had sold the few remaining Bellini assets, the jewelry, the artwork, the small properties that had escaped Veron's grasp. She had enough money to start over, to build a new life, somewhere peaceful, somewhere safe. She had told Veron about her plans during one of her visits to the clinic. He had listened silently, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. Sadness? Regret? Acceptance? He had not tried to stop her. He had not begged her to stay. He had simply nodded, his gaze fixed on her. "I understand," he had said, his voice hoarse, his breath still ragged. "You deserve a better life. A life free from me." Katerina had felt a pang of something. Guilt? Sorrow? She couldn't quite define it. "What about you?" she had asked, her voice trembling slightly. Veron had smiled, a faint, wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I will survive," he had said. "I always do." He had reached out, his hand taking hers, his fingers brushing against her skin. "Thank you, Katerina," he had said, his voice low and earnest. "For everything. For saving my life. For showing me another way." His words had hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Katerina had met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of sadness, regret, and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. She had left the clinic, her heart heavy, her mind torn. She had made her decision, her choice. She was leaving. But as she stood on the balcony of her apartment, watching the sun rise over Rome, she felt a hesitation,
A doubt.
a lingering question. Was she making the right choice? Was she running away from her problems, from her past, from Veron? Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. Footsteps, approaching slowly, cautiously. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest. Veron stood in the doorway, his face pale, his body still weak, but his eyes were filled with a new light. A light of determination, of hope, of love. He had escaped the clinic, defied his doctors, risked his life, to come to her. "Katerina," he said, his voice hoarse, his breath still ragged. "I couldn't let you go." Not without telling you. He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on her. I love you, Katerina," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I know I don't deserve you. I know I've hurt you. I know I've destroyed everything, but I love you. And I need you." His words, his confession, stunned her. She had not expected this, not from him. She stared at him, her mind reeling, her heart overflowing with a complex mixture of emotions. Fear, doubt, anger, regret, and yes, love. She loved him too. She had known it, deep down for a long time, but she had been afraid to admit it, to herself, to him. She took a step towards him, her hand reaching out to his, her fingers intertwining with his. "I love you too, Marco," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. But I don't know if I can trust you." Veron nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know," he said. "And I will spend the rest of my life proving myself to you. Earning your trust. Earning your love." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, his body holding hers. Katerina rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling the warmth of his embrace. They stood there, together, on the balcony, watching the sun rise over Rome, a new beginning, a fresh start. Their future was uncertain, their path would be difficult, but they would face it together, hand in hand, heart to heart. The fallen queen and the reformed lion, bound by a shared past, a shared pain, and a shared love. A love born in darkness, forged in fire, and destined to rise from the ashes. The end.